Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Rose and Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chawla, and as always, I'm joined by CEO and Head of Research, Mr. Brunello Rosa. This week, we'll be talking about the IMF's World Economic Outlook, some very interesting news. Brunello, there's been a really big announcement and where the IMF has certified a global stagflationary shock. Can you tell me a bit more about what that means?
Yes, the IMF and the World Bank held their annual catch-up meetings, the so-called spring meetings that unfortunately, so to speak, also this year were held in mostly virtual format. It was a hybrid format, allowing some participants in DC, most participants from the respective countries. This is, of course, due to the still ongoing restrictions of the pandemic, and together with the meetings, they have published one of the flagship publications, which is of course the World Economic Forum, which contains which contains the forecast of the IMF for 2 to 3 years ahead. The IMF could do nothing but kind of confirming that there's an ongoing stagflationary shock to the global economy that has reduced growth and increased inflation in the short run. Just to give you an idea, global growth is now expected to be 3.6% in 2022 and 2023, compared to 6.1% in 2021. So quite a big downward revision. And in terms of inflation, it's now expected to be 5.7% in advanced economies and 8.7% in emerging markets. And again, we are talking about almost 2% upward revision, 3% upward revision respectively for advanced economies and developing markets. So the IMF had to take into account the double whammy represented by the negative supply shocks of the pandemic and the war, and these forecasts just reflect those shocks.
So like you said, I mean, there's this sort of two things that kind of comprise a stagflationary shock. There's the high inflation element, and then there's a low economic growth element. Let's unpack both of them a little bit. So the first, the high inflation, what's been causing that?
Well, has been a combination of factors. Mostly has been the disruption in global supply chains that was initially caused by the pandemic, of course, made worse by the war, and then the increase in energy prices that was caused initially by the reopening of the economy when the restrictions due to the pandemic were lifted partially or totally, and then, of course, the war in Ukraine that has caused an increase in gas prices, oil prices, and all energy products effectively. There are then, of course, some increase in wages that have been observed in a number of countries due to the so-called Great Resignation movement, if you want. Lots of people voluntarily left their jobs because they thought they were somehow exploited, they were not happy with the way they were treated during the pandemic. They were looking for better working conditions, higher salaries. And so companies had to adapt and increase their salaries. This is also because there has been so much discussion about the reduction in income inequality that eventually we saw an upward increase in minimum wages and in some hourly payments as well. These, I would say, are the short-term causes of the shock. Medium term, we will see the cost of the energy transition, of the technological transition, and again, of the fairer distribution of income between capital and labor that will have an impact on inflation much more lasting than the short-term impacts that were just discussed.
Interesting. So some sort of factors have been going on for a while, and then a couple that are short-term and sort of catalyzing the ones that exist. And I imagine it's quite similar for the reasons that explain the low economic growth. Let's unpack that a bit more. What's causing that?
Well, again, to some extent, these negative supply shocks have also the effect of reducing growth, and the fact that supply chains are disrupted means that some supplies do not arrive on time, and therefore some products are not delivered. The typical example is the semiconductors, the microchips that are used for the engines of cars, and therefore car production has collapsed as the production of other manufacturing goods. And to some extent, we saw that during the pandemic, services collapsed and goods manufacturing, in fact, increased. Now is somehow the reverse. Services are holding up decently well, but manufacturing is, in fact, suffering a lot from this reduction in or disruption in global supply chains. And of course, the increase in energy prices means that the cost of production for many industries increase, and therefore companies have to make a decision on what and when and how much to produce, given these increased bill costs.
Very nice. So that was the World Economic the World Bank and the IMF's predictions. We're also in the run-up to the Indonesian presidency of the G20. They just had a meeting for the finance ministers and the central bank governors in Washington, where they discussed much of these concerns. And I think in an era where we're seeing increasing U.S.-China polarization, the thought of some of the biggest policymakers coming together to address these issues can only be a good thing. Can we expect much, do you think, from the G20 coming up?
As we're discussing some of our recent analysis, including that from John Halsman on the Geopolitical Corner, one of the effects of this polarization is that multilateral fora are not working as well or as effectively as they should. The United Nations Security Council being, of course, the first victim, if you want, of this polarization. But we are somehow used to that. During the Cold War, there was already a severe division between the US and the Soviet Union. Now is mostly between US and China, with Russia having sided with China. But is the polarization and the division of the Security Council that we have seen before. Less expected was potentially the ineffectiveness of the new forum that has been created in the last few years, which is the G20, which effectively came to the fore in 2008, 2009, during the global financial crisis, as the only place in which all the major economies in the world, both advanced economies and developing economies, could gather together and discuss global governance. Now, if you have a G20 meeting in which half of the participants side with the US, half the participants side with China and Russia and so on, it's not going to be extremely effective. That's the level, I would say, of head of states and head of government. Clearly, when you go a central bank level meeting or finance minister level, there are still, these are mostly technocrats that, of course, still want to find technical solutions to issues. And so somehow it's good news that they met in DC, and they managed to say that multilateral fora are still very important to resolve complex policy issues, such as those that come from the negative supply shocks we discussed before. Unsurprisingly, the G20 meeting of governors and finance minister ended up by saying that central banks now need to focus mostly on inflation rather than support to economic activity. So somehow it's a sort of green light to central banks around the globe to say, okay, if you need to increase interest rates, just do it. As the same way, in the past, the G20 gave green light to more fiscal support, increasing deficit and debt, and in some cases, green light to central banks to adopt unconventional policy measures such as QE, forward guidance, and similar measures. So to some extent, it's still important that the G20 meets, the G20 reaches some some conclusion, although they're not totally unexpected and totally original, but at least they show that there is some vitality in multilateral organizations. I don't think this will be reflected at the higher level of governments, and so head of states and head of government. But it is always important that these multilateral meetings are held, and that at least an attempt to reach a decent compromise is made, whether that's eventually obtained or not.
Right. I mean, it seems like there's lots of different moving parts here, and parts that'll, keep evolving for the time to come. The war still goes on. Some of the most developing countries, COVID is still a very real thing, and the economic measures to recoil from that are still going on. So definitely a story we'll keep our eye on, especially as the G20 comes up in a few months. But as always, Brunello, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you very much. Until next time.